We completed all the material through page 9 of lesson 2, looked at some statistics, and we've looked at some various views of perspectives that people have of the Bible. And you'll remember as a matter of fact, back on page 7, there's quite a chart on page 7 that deals with some approaches to inspiration and then people's view about the Bible. And of course, we find ourselves at the bottom of that, of believing in verbal plenary inspiration, word by word, in the entire body of Scripture, and that it is God-breathed and given to us 100% by God. So we looked at those. We went through the questions on page 8. We went through the other information and chart that we have on page 9. And so this brings us to the top of page 10. Before we begin, though, we want to have a word of prayer. And then, Hoyt, would you lead us in prayer, please, for this class, please? Oh, I keep asking Hoyt. He's become the prayer for the class. I apologize. I'm looking around, Tom says he'll do it. Okay, I don't want to flip a coin in Bible class. Tom, go ahead and do it.
Dear Lord, our great glorious Father in heaven, we're so thankful that we can meet here safely without persecution. We're also so thankful that we have people that can go through the Bible and be able to teach us a deeper meaning and help with us to understand it. Lord, there are several people that are sick. Please be with them. And traveling, please be with them too, Lord. And be with those other teachers and see if our country and world can slowly gravitate to what is the truth. It is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. All right. And when you look at the top of page 10, I think a lot of us are familiar with some information that typically is brought out that when you look at the scope of the Bible, and again, the common things we understand from the book of Genesis through Malachi, the Old Testament is 39 books. Then the gospel accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we characteristically talk about the beginning of the New Testament. But in Matthew, then through Revelation, we have the New Testament and those 27 books. Then we also have a period of time between the book of Malachi in the Old Testament, the last prophet, and chronologically, that is correct. I think most of us are aware of the fact that the Old Testament is not in exact chronological arrangement. It's not. But it is true that Malachi was the last prophet of the Old Testament prophecies. And after Malachi had finished his prophecies, then who would be the next prophet that would emerge some 400 years later? Very good, isn't it? John the Baptist. And as he was preparing the way for Christ. But what we have there is considered in a 400-year period of prophetic silence. It's often referred to as an intertestamental period of time because we have the Old Testament and then we have the New Testament. And between the two testaments is approximately 400 years of silence. We've talked about that in a lot of different kinds of classes through the years. But when you look at the top of page 10, when we look at the Bible taken over 15 centuries, Hebrew has evolved in many ways. We're talking about the language of Hebrews. Phonetically and dialect and spelling and the use of certain words and the assimilation of words and vocabulary, expressions and phrases from other languages, and style of writing and in grammar. As it says, we have two major biblical languages, and technically speaking, there are three, but there are two major biblical languages that take us back to the Old Testament and New Testament. So what are the two languages that are the biblical languages? Yeah, so there's Hebrew and Greek, and what's often referred to as biblical Hebrew, which did become early on a written language, and then it was a verbal language as well. And then there's a Greek, but very specifically, what kind of Greek? Koine Greek. And Koine itself is a Greek word, and what does Koine mean? Common, because it was the common language Greek. And really, in some respects, even a simpler form of Greek, but it was a Greek that was spoken during the days of Jesus, during the days of the New Testament. Now, we also find in some of the Old Testament, and even some of the quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament by Jesus himself, that there's another language that was used in quoting the Old Testament. And what language was that? Very good, Aramaic. And Aramaic, now understand that Aramaic and Hebrew, the Hebrew language and the Aramaic language, they share a common alphabet. But linguistically, there are some considerable differences. Idiomatically, figurative speech is just like any languages, there would be changes. But we would also see some variations and some words that are very different and spelled quite differently. The example that I always give by comparison of the difference between biblical Hebrew and biblical Aramaic is kind of like the difference of what we might see. There's a couple of ways you could do this. Let's take Spanish and Portuguese. Now, would we not understand, we understand and appreciate that Spanish and Portuguese in many, many respects are very close languages. And there's a lot of words that would be the same and some that are very close, but there are significant differences as well. That's even true that if one is to speak Spanish, let's say, for example, in Mexico, and even that, there's a variety of dialects depending on where you are in Mexico. But even as one would speak Spanish, but let's say they came from Mexico, as opposed to the Spanish Castilian that would be spoken in Spain. There again we see same alphabet, a lot of commonalities, but there's going to be some differences. And one of the classical differences, for example, in Hebrew and in Aramaic would take us even to the difference between Matthew and Mark in the recording of Jesus on the cross. When what translated in English, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now he used an expression and it was translated as such. Who can quote that in the Hebrew? Who can quote that in the Hebrew? You've all said it before. You've heard it many, many, many times. How would that go?
You mean the Eloi, lama sabachthani?
Well, that's Aramaic.
Are you referring to?
Yeah. And so we have Eli, lama sabachthani, as opposed to Eloi, lama sabachthani. Very, very, very close, because one is given, and it would only make sense that Matthew would use more of a pure type of Hebrew. Matthew is written, the gospel is written from a very Jewish perspective, where Mark actually is written from a Roman perspective, but why would you have some of those variations? But again, it sounds very, very much the same, doesn't it? Eli, lama sabachthani, as opposed to Eloi, lama sabachthani. In fact, the last part is almost spot on the same. So I'm going to show some of that in just a little bit. But you have these biblical languages. Now, how many of you have heard it said, well, the biblical languages are a dead language, like biblical Hebrew or Koine Greek, that it's a dead language? Has anybody heard that besides myself and Vance? We've heard that. That's really not true. That's just not true. There are dead languages. Now, there's languages that are just not spoken anymore, not as a common language. Can somebody come up with what really truly is a dead language? That there's no country, no society today that actually speaks a particular language. Can anybody come up with an example of that? Latin. Really the only ones that speak any parts and bits of Latin would be whom? Doctors and attorneys. Okay? Because there are so many of the words and vocabulary which they use that will be Latin, a lot of that. A lot of your Latin expressions in jurisprudence and in legal things. But the thing is that Latin really is not a used spoken language today in any society. There's not a country today, you can't go to some town in Italy and they say, oh, we still speak Latin here. They just don't do that. Now, while Koine Greek in that particular dialect is a dialect that was very peculiar to a period of time, and yet the vocabulary and the nuances of the language, for the most part, are very, very much of what's spoken in Greece today. Now, so never call Koine Greek a dead language, not in the sense of what Latin is. There are some things that make it interesting and peculiar, that because idioms can change in figures of speech in the way that it is used in the New Testament, there may be some things that we look at that and say, well, that was kind of a fixed feature back in the day, and they probably wouldn't use that expression today because it would be peculiar. But we find that in our own language all the time, do we not, in the English language? The English language is ever changing, and we're ever changing the use of words, for example. I mean, can you imagine, and I've used this example in other classes before, but can you imagine 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago, and you know, Jack is from Oklahoma, and Jack knows what it means to be a cowboy and work out a ranch. Right, Jack? I mean, Oklahoma's got a lot of cowboys, a lot of ranches. But 60 years ago, Jack, when you were just a mere 30 years old, think about that. But anyway, but if somebody would have come up to you 60 years ago in Oklahoma and said, I want you to know something, Jack, I'm a bad dude. Well, what was a dude 60 years ago? If somebody owned a dude ranch, what was that?
I'm trying to think what it would have been back then.
Yeah, what would have been back then? I tell you what, it's so much different what it is today. You know, in fact, surfers talk about dudes today, right? I mean, I used to tell all the time, which one was it? One of the trainees, and it took only about a week or two to get him to stop calling me dude. I said, listen, I am not dude. But you know, and then bad. If you said you're a bad dude, some might think, well, you're kind of a fancy cowboy, but you're not a very good person or something, you know, but bad is good and dude is just a dude, I guess. But anyway, what I'm saying, our own language changes. We wouldn't say that in any sense that, you know, even think about when Dennis loves to come up here and read from his King James Version of the Bible, which he does frequently. There are a lot of expressions that he's reading that King James Version of the Bible that would you venture to say, Dennis, that there's X amount of members out here that don't have a clue what some of those words and phrases mean?
Yeah.
Now, I know what Dennis' position is. Well, they need to learn what those mean. Okay, but... Yeah, what's that?
I can tell them what it means.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is because a translation in English in 1611 is remarkably different than a translation in the 20th or 21st century. And we've had more translations made in the 20th and 21st century than any period of time imaginable, right? But yet we would never say that English was ever, even Old English, it's not a matter of being a dead language. It's had significant changes, idiomatically, even spelling. Spelling's different. The shapes of the letters. Go look at my copy, my original copy from Erasmus on my wall. It's an original, 1524. And try to read that. It's in English. Try to read it. Try to identify the letters. It's English. It's beautiful, perfect English. It's not in English we read today. Well, the same thing is true even when it comes to many of the ancient Semitic languages. Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about Semitic languages? Which one do I have up here first? Actually, I think I'm going to switch. Well, you know what? We'll come back to that. But what do I mean by Semitic languages? What are Semitic languages? There are a few that were major Semitic languages. And again, you've already mentioned the few of them, that when you're talking about Aramaic, Hebrew, those. But, you know, there are some Syriac languages, Phoenician languages, or some other languages that would take us all the way back to the days, even of the days of close to Abraham and some of these languages. By the time that we have the children of Israel, Hebrew people and a language that is developed. And by the way, according to the biblical record, when did this variety of languages all develop anyway? When did that happen? The Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. You know, somebody says, well, how does that work? Well, there's a lot of things that work that way. With the procreation of mankind from two people, God is going to have that work with other sons and daughters in Adam and Eve. And we realized that in the beginning of how God can make the population go like that. How he can spread man upon the face of the earth. How he can confuse the languages. You know what? If God could do it all, if he could do the creation in 6 days, do you think that he would have any problem of confounding the languages and having people speak these languages just like that? Not at all. And it's interesting because from a linguistic, historical standpoint, you can only go back so far and really get back to the beginning of certain languages. You just think, all of a sudden you come to a dead halt, because languages, what were they first? Were they oral or were they written to begin with? Well, they're oral. And there are many languages. In fact, there are some languages that continue to exist for years and years that were never written languages. They were simply verbal, oral languages only. Okay? So it's fascinating. Now here's the Bible, written by about 40 different people that God used over a period of 1,500 years, nearly 1,600 years. And these men came from a lot of different cultures and backgrounds, had varying degrees of education. Many of these individuals did not know each other because they were separated either by geography or by time. And yet what we see is this continuous, harmonious whole within the biblical literature. That in itself is kind of an evidence towards inspiration when you think of this common thread that is seen within the Scripture. This paragraph, this lengthy paragraph on page 10, for example, it says, for example, there's a striking difference in the use of prose, because, you have prose, you have poetry, you have all these different forms of writing. But there's a striking difference in the use of prose in Genesis and Samuel. I mean, you just see it. You see it when you study the language, when you read the language, even syntactically. And by the way, when we talk about syntax in language, syntactically, what are we really talking about there? I'll pick on you, Ellen. What are we talking about when we say language and we speak syntactically? Yeah, it has a lot to do with word order. Some languages, they start with a verb, and then they build from there. Other languages start with a subject, which may very well be the main noun of the sentence, and they build from there. Syntactically, there's a difference between English. I'll give you the common, because most languages like Spanish, Italian, are like Greek and Hebrew. Let's take adjectives, for example. In English, where do we normally put the adjective in English? In English. In other words, we say the brown cow, right? So we put the adjective in front. But most languages, like Spanish, and true with most Greek and Hebrew expressions, that you find that the adjective follows the noun. That's syntax. And so you have to kind of look at this, and then these things become very meaningful too, to make sure that we've got the words in the right order for translation purposes. Or else you can really mix things up in their meaning if you don't get the word order right. I love Brother W. Horton used to give this analogy all the time, that when it came to linguistics and syntactical approach, and he used to hold a lot of gospel meetings. He's a Texas boy. He was from Texas, preached in San Antonio for years. Did a lot of preaching up and down the San Joaquin Valley. And he loved to talk about those Portuguese farmers over there in Visalia, Tulare, Hanford, and those areas. And we would say, well, the cow jumped over the fence. But because of the way they think in Portuguese, and when they said that in English, they wouldn't say the cow jumped over the fence. They said over the fence, the cow did jump. Because the way they would establish their verbs and so. That's syntax. You're going to find that, and that becomes a real challenge at times in translation. And translation can become a challenge then in understanding and interpretation. You have all of these schools that fit together. So the point that is being made here is that the original Hebrew, in fact, another example, the original Hebrew, the editor of the one that was writing the Chronicles, the accounts of the Chronicles of those books of the Kings, and the Ezra memoirs are full of Aramaisms of every kind. When you talk about Aramaic, you think, wait a minute, because there's this real Aramaic influence that is in there. The official book of Nehemiah, which is interesting because Ezra and Nehemiah, one follows the other, right? When we study the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, what was the main work that was going on in the book of Ezra? What was the main work that was going on in the book of Ezra? Rebuilding what? The temple. And I mean, a massive workforce, and there's the rebuilding of the temple because Cyrus had issued the decree for these Judeans to go back to Judea and to, under the direction of Zerubbabel, and to rebuild this temple. And then, who was contemporary with Ezra, was a scribe by the name of Nehemiah. In fact, he was a cupbearer to the king. But Nehemiah, in the book of Nehemiah, what was the main thing that they were going to redo and build in the book of Nehemiah? The walls around Jerusalem, and that was a huge project. Well, here they're contemporary, dealing with the same people, dealing with the same kind of period, not kind of, but really the same period of time, and yet there's some stark differences linguistically in the style of the Hebrew writing from Ezra to Nehemiah. And that is the point that is being made here. And again, but not that there's not contradictions, but we just see these different styles. And so the official book of Nehemiah is pure in Hebrew in some ways than that of some passages of Chronicles through Ezra. But Nehemiah reveals its imperial Aramaic origin and background by its sentence structure and word order. The Hebrew of the book of Job, I've been reading the book of Job a lot lately. and Ecclesiastes, which I just preached on Sunday, is quite distinct from classical Hebrew. Even so, the language of Job is much closer to classical Hebrew, though Job contains a great many words and expressions which are foreign to all known earlier Hebrew literature. Most scholars believe who wrote the book of Job? Moses. And most scholars believe that Job was a part of what era? Yeah, that's right, the patriarchs. So when you think about it, it would only make sense that if you're going back to the patriarchal age, which is represented in the book of Genesis, then we might see why the language could be significantly different, even in an earlier, more classical form of the Hebrew language, all right? For example, Northern Hebrew more closely resembled Phoenician. Eastern Hebrew resembled Aramaic. Southern Hebrew at times resembled Southern Canaanite or Amorite than Moabite, Egyptian, or Proto-Sinaitic. Such differences may be found in biblical scriptures. And here's a couple more examples. The language of Ecclesiastes is much more obviously like Phoenician and reveals an early stage of the Hebrew language of law and the courts. Ecclesiastes contains no Aramaisms, though the book of Ezra does. Aramaic, which was the principal language of Persia, has also undergone changes over 4 centuries, and such differences are also found in the Bible. Daniel used an imperial Aramaic. Jesus used the Aramaic of Palestine. And there's a difference there of those, and you got several years difference as well. So I'm going to show some language things here in just a little bit because we're going to be coming back to this. But now I'm going to go to this section of materials used by the writers. And the Bible is the result of documents that were not only ancient, but that were transmitted and preserved through the years by means of writing. Thus, the whole history of the Bible is dependent upon, 1, the history of the materials used in the making of ancient books, and 2, the history of writing. And so I just have some examples that when we look at materials used for writing ancient documents. And the very first one, and we're not surprised at all, that we have stone. And when we look at this particular stone, I know that that's not probably real clear to everybody. And can anybody figure out maybe what language that might be? I'll give you a hint if I say unshul. But it's Greek, but it's basically pretty much in capital letters. Why that's what's referred to as an unshul. All right. But can you imagine how meticulous they were that they would have these great amount of tablets of stone? And now we know that Moses witnessed God, the finger of God, do what? Write on tablets of stone the 10 Commandments. But that was an inspired, miraculous event, wasn't it? But now understand that there were scribes, that this is what they did. They took, and perhaps there was another scribe that had copied down the history, maybe even the dictation from the king or for some other particular court official, and would write it down, and maybe it would be on papyrus, maybe it would be on leather, but now then they take it for a permanent feature to put it on stone. And we know that a lot of this is found in Egypt and Babylonia. In fact, it says in Egypt and Babylonia, the earliest inscriptions were made on stone surfaces. The whole history of the Bible is dependent upon the history of the materials but these inscriptions were made of stone surfaces. Considerable portions of the oldest Hebrew writing found in Palestine are also on stone. And again, we're familiar with this whole idea from Exodus 20 to Exodus 31 that what you have is these things that were written on stone. Written on stone. Now, then they would make clay tablets. And so we look at clay, and there were, how many of you are familiar with the term a cuneiform? Cuneiform. And there are cuneiforms, and sometimes there would be, have any of you ever seen cylindrical cuneiforms? And that would be like a cylinder. It'd be round. In fact, some of those they could even almost use like a seal because they could roll. But there would be cylindrical cuneiforms. And there are cuneiform type of language as well. Phoenician and Syrian were very much for that. I'm not sure. I believe this is probably some kind of Phoenician here, but it is a man-made surface. In other words, it's not like just taking a carving stone and slate and now we're going to carve on that, but now just making clay, taking these clay tablets. And huge libraries of clay tablets have been unearthed in Assyria and Babylonia. By the way, when we talk about the Bible lands of Assyria and Babylonia, and I probably should put a map up, but I didn't, but you got maps in the back of your Bible. But modern day, what are we talking about today when we're talking about Assyria? Just look at my map here. So Assyria to the north and Babylon to the south and east. Where are we talking about today? Yeah, so Iran, Iraq, and then going down to the the Persian Gulf, for example, Kuwait and all that. So, but you understand that was during much of the biblical times. That was pretty much about as far east civilization for a while would be, and of course until you come on to the Macedonian Empire, because we know of the travels and the work of Alexander the Great, who went beyond Persia and traveled as far east as India. And so, but it's just fascinating that archaeologically, that how many libraries have been found with clay tablets. And then we do know, but one that would not be quite so durable would be wood, and where they would actually take wood. And this is a sample of wood, and you can almost kind of see the grain on that going across. But you know, what's going to be one of the problems with wood that you don't have so much with stone or even with clay? Yeah, termites, right. I mean, you're going to have this deterioration, and really, seriously, you could have termites and those kinds of things, and not going to hold up very well in weather and so forth. But for many centuries, wooden tablets were used as writing surfaces and Greece, for example. And wooden writing tablets have also been found both in Egypt and Palestine. And there's some passages that will deal with that period of time, even in the book of Habakkuk. And then when we think about another that became very, very popular, and that would be leather. And so when we look at this, and now when it comes to biblical manuscripts, this is going to be a much newer type of manuscript. However, manuscripts like this one often had seals on them, but they would be put in columns. But when you found that the leather had pages and a binding, this kind of manuscript on leather with columns and binding in a book form, there's another term for that. And what do they call that manuscript, that book form? Say it again. Codex. Exactly. And so the singular is codex, and if you have several of them, you have a codice. Codices, that's the plural of it. And so, and there have been preserved through the years, many codices that are centuries and centuries and centuries, even millennia old. Think about it. If they're well taken care of, preserved, then you know what? They will withstand a lot. Think of leather is going to be much more durable than some other materials. In fact, what else? Leather was unquestionably the principal material employed for the literary purposes by the Hebrews. The scribe's knife used for the purpose of erasures is mentioned, by the way, in Jeremiah 36:23, where they could do changes, erasures. This furnishes good evidence that the scroll mentioned in this verse was a leather scroll. The Jewish Talmud, a code of traditional laws, explicitly required that the scriptures be copied on animal skins. When in New Testament times, the Apostle Paul requests that parchments be sent to him, 2 Timothy 4:13, it is likely that he is speaking of copied portions of the old scriptures, but parchments. But a lot of times the parchments wasn't just like, we think of parchment paper today, but parchments could be a lot of different kinds of materials, including leather, which would be much more durable. Now, one thing that would certainly be more durable, but was used a lot, was papyrus. And when you typically think of papyrus, you even think about how long ago and to what periods of history. Yeah, even Egyptian dynasties, Hoyt, that's exactly right, Egyptian dynasties. And have any of you ever watched, you could go on YouTube and go online, you can go to YouTube, and they have these different things that will show you how to make papyrus today. It's interesting, our daughter Quinn, she had been involved in a couple of different classes through the years, and now she's even done for some of their own projects of how to make paper, right? Making paper. And that's fascinating, quite a bit of work. Now you can think about when you got to do that by hand, and when you take, whatever materials, papyrus, those type of reeds and plant materials that you would use, it's quite a process. But they can make this paper. But there again, depending on how it was stored and where it was, and if it's exposed to too much sunlight, if it gets wet, then this becomes very problematic. And again, the durability is not that high. And yet it is amazing how many papyrus and what are referred to in the biblical, in the papyri, in the plural, in the papyri, when you talk about biblical documents in the New Testament, they're even coded in number, and there are thousands and thousands of New Testament copies, of various parts of the copies, in what's called the papyri. And those are housed in certain museums and very, very, very fascinating, I might add. Now, when you talk about vellum, a different kind of parchment, vellum resulted in an improved process of perfecting the treatment of skins for the purposes of writing. Originally, vellum denoted skins of calves and antelopes, while parchment referred to materials obtained from sheep and goats. Just because of the different quality and density of the animal skin. The two most valuable New Testament manuscripts in existence today are outstanding representatives of the high-quality vellum. And so, by the way, this is an original page of the Codex Vaticanus. So we have three major codices in the Alexandrinus, and the Sinaiticus, and the Vaticanus. In the Vaticanus, because what does that kind of sound like? The Vatican, because of where it was housed, who owned it, where it was housed for a good number of years, but very high quality vellum. And so this vellum, those two most valuable New Testament manuscripts in existence are outstanding representatives. Vellum is much more durable than papyrus and was selected from the 4th century AD through the Middle Ages. Not that it didn't exist before, but it was very highly selected, and as the principal medium for the written word of God, as they would do that. If you go up to, and Hoyt's very, very aware of this, and you go up to Hearst Castle, and Hoyt, I believe it's in Hearst, is it in his personal bedroom, where there's these beautiful lampshades that are, and they're vellum. Is that his bedroom? I'm trying to remember which room. It's up there on that floor, and it's got writing and whatnot on them, but they are just outstanding. And I forget how do you remember how old those are, perchance? But they are outstanding examples of vellum, and that was a type of material that was used a lot. May I have any questions or comments about these materials? Yes, Cindy.
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
I was just getting ready to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we're going to have a section on it later. I was just getting ready to go to that. What's your question?
Oh, what were they written on, and how well are they preserved?
Yeah, and they were written on a variety of things. And so they weren't written just on one thing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for the most part, are approximately 2,100 years old, and which takes us to the intertestamental period of time. Most believe that the scribes known as the Essenes seem to be the authors, the scribes that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not just biblical literature. In fact, it's all kinds of literature, all kinds of materials that are found, including shopping grocery lists, and then even some other like types of documents that dealt with kind of city-type business and whatnot. But you have biblical writings as well, and then not only copies of Old Testament Hebrew writings, but then some very old commentaries. One of the best-known, most ancient commentaries on the book of Habakkuk was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Various kinds of leather, some papyrus. There is what is known as the very famous the copper scroll that was found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I didn't bring that up because those are very rare, and that just was not a common. But literally, can you imagine that where they would make and pound out the copper very thin, and then write upon it, as however they would do that, I'm sure by pounding and whatnot, and then could roll that, and beautiful copper scroll was discovered with that. Some on some beautiful lamb-type skins of vellum, again, that were done. And then there were various kinds of parchment and papyrus that were found. Now, how were they stored? How were the most of the Dead Sea Scrolls stored? In clay pots or clay jars. Now, and where were these discovered? In the caves of Qumran, right? And there were 11 principal caves in Qumran. And in those 11 caves, many of those clay jars actually even had lids on them. Now, some didn't have the lids. Some of the clay pots had broken through the years. But most historians and scholars believed that many of those had been unseen and untouched for over 2,000 years. Now, what's the climate there in that area, the Dead Sea? Very extremely arid and dry. Not semi-arid, but arid climate. Can you imagine them tucked away in a cave, in a clay pot, in a very arid climate, untouched, no sunlight, no rain, no moisture. And for all those years, why some of them were so well preserved that they could even very carefully, meticulously unroll the scrolls. Now, a lot of them began to kind of fragment and whatnot. But and we'll be showing some pictures of that most likely later on. But when they began, and when were they initially discovered, the Dead Sea Scrolls? Do you remember when that was? 1947. Just a couple years after World War II. And what it's saying, a Bedouin priest, a Bedouin shepherd was taking a flock, and his son was with him. And his son saw these caves way up, these cliffs and these caves, and he was taking rocks and just seeing if he could throw and hit the hole, hit the cave, the rock, and he hit one, and he heard something clink. And they figured out something was up there, and climb, only discover all these clay pots and many other caves that had them too, and they've been untouched for all those years. I've got to tell you something right now, brethren. That's the providence of God. Because what was discovered amongst many types of writings were legitimizing, validating the biblical writings of the Hebrew Old Testament over and over again. Do you realize up to 1947, we did not have a complete scroll or manuscript of the book of Isaiah. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, guess what? There were 2 complete scrolls found. Over 2,100 years old. And through all that had been translated from the bits and the pieces and so forth through the years. I mean, even when Jerome did the Latin Vulgate in the 5th century AD, in the translation, when they were able to go through and translate the book of Isaiah, did they find discrepancies or problems or mistakes from what we had? No. Not at all. In fact, it added to the verification of the biblical manuscript. So, lots of different materials. An incredible way. Now, they built these huge buildings. These large, like shed-type buildings. And these are buildings that made up about 4 of our building in length this way. With these large tables. And I have old black and white photographs of them working on the Dead Sea Scrolls with magnifying glasses, but they put windows in the ceiling for light, and they had that, and so for weeks, for years, man, you had sunlight pouring down on those and then you watch guys, and they're going through putting pieces together, and they got cigarettes hanging out their mouths, and they're putting the pieces together of this stuff. And you think, one little ash, one little, whatever you call that, spark, can you imagine the damage it would do? But it's amazing. It is a fascinating study in the preservation of those scrolls. Appreciate the question. We're going to have a whole section on the Dead Sea Scrolls much down the line. But that stuff is just interesting to me. Any other questions or comments? Okay, now, we're getting to the, no we won't. Where did the time go? Okay, well, we have more to say about languages next week, and I'm going to show you some examples of the Aramaic and Hebrew alphabet and language, and the Greek as well, and we'll do that. We'll have a little fun with that. It'll be a test, and so we'll go with that. And then, but we are, now I handed out a couple weeks ago, if you did not get a copy of 3, who needs 3?